Regarding Viren, it's that a lot of the more positive and the more negative parts of him cannot be disconnected from each other, and that makes him a much more interesting character. People are not simply assigned good traits and bad traits, and life is not simply about developing good traits and ameliorating bad ones. Often they are linked together, and the same trait, the same part of one's personality, the same preferences and beliefs and priorities can lead to both positive and negative outcomes. One of the great examples of this from classical drama is the tale of Oedipus. Who is Oedipus as a character? He's a character defined by his capacity to solve riddles. He is considered brilliant because he is able to solve the riddle of the Sphinx. But ultimately, his unveiling the riddle of his own parentage, of his own family history, is what causes him this paroxysm of immense grief and terror as he realizes what he did. He realizes that he killed his father and married his mother. Life can be like that sometimes, and it certainly is like that for Viren. There are traits of his character, his sheer egotism, his narrowness of vision, his coldness to his kids, especially Soren, that make him villainous, but these are not necessarily the traits that cause his downfall. He is someone who fundamentally wants to correct what he sees as an unjust world. He is motivated by good causes, and he is not necessarily misguided in his pursuit of those causes. It is simply that he pursues those causes too far and too ardently and too narrowly. He overestimates his own capacity to transform the world for the better without compromise, without conversation with others, and that leads to his growing obsession and his final defeat. It is a much more conflicted and ambivalent character than would simply be ascertained by thinking of him as someone who has this mix of good traits and bad traits. The two are inevitably intermixed. A lot of the same traits that propel him to make a lot of stances that people can reasonably like and think are admirable. That stubbornness, that willfulness, that resistance to accepting the injustices of the world. These same traits are also what lead him to become so obsessive later on. Say what you will about Viren, but he always has a plan. He always develops a scheme to oppose what he views as unfortunate and unjust circumstances. He believes the dragons and elves have an unjust degree of power over humanity, in large part because of their control over magic. So he deeply develops his skill in dark magic as an attempt to match the capacities of the elves and the dragons. Dark magic is suggested to be something old and ancient, but it's also something modern. It's roughly equivalent to technology, to the capacity for humanity to manipulate its environment for its own benefit, and in doing so overcome the challenges posed by the natural world. This has problems in that it positions humanity as opposed to the natural world and extracting its resources, a problem that we in this environmentalist age are much more conscious of. But it is hard to fault anyone for admiring technology to such a degree when it has had such a positive effect on human life. People don't have to live in fear of the elements anymore. People don't have to live in fear that every disease they get is going to kill them. People don't have to constantly worry that they are these minor specks of life in an indifferent and apathetic world of tornadoes and thunderstorms and typhoons. Human society is more substantial and more hardy now because of technology. The problem is when technology is pursued only for its own sake, or when dark magic in this instance is pursued only for its own sake. It becomes an obsession. It becomes a force that gives this illusion of complete control over one's natural environment that leads to one thinking of the world purely in terms of resources to extract, purely as a world to manipulate to one's own whim. And this is exactly what happens to Viren. It is that same stubbornness, that same brutal unwillingness to accept a world that he believes to be cruel and indifferent to human flourishing that ultimately leads to him becoming rather monomaniac and rather harsh and single-minded in his pursuit of what he believes to be the best interest of humanity, ultimately leading to the suffering of the people he cares about. He deeply cared about Sarai. I don't think that he was nakedly exploiting her death for his own apathetic reasons. I think he genuinely admired and respected her. He does want revenge against the dragons for Sarai's death. But that is not necessarily merely a result of his cruelty and his own loathing of those who go against his will. He ultimately cares about justice, and he believes that this is justice. He wants it for himself, and he wants it for Harrow. And it is true that Avazandum tyrannized humanity and blocked human ambitions. As long as Avazandum still lived, humanity could not prosper. This is evidenced by Sarai's death, but it is not purely motivated by a desire for revenge. And so he does, along with Harrow, kill Thunder Avazandum. But ultimately, this does not solve the conflicts between the elves and dragons on one side and the humans on the other. It only intensifies those conflicts. It does not help heal Harrow's grief. It only makes him increasingly doubtful and resentful of the choices he has made. Ultimately, the conflict amplifies and Harrow himself dies. This then intensifies Viren's grief and his bitterness. He does not have a lot of people that he cares about anymore. It throws him further into his obsession with Erebos. He is like someone who is drowning and responds by flailing his arms faster and harder. Impulsively, it seems like a sensible reaction, but in the long term, it is counterproductive and only accelerates the drowning process. every step Viren takes is not necessarily illogical. It is perfectly understandable why he makes the choice he does regarding Thunderavasandam. It is completely understandable that the death of Harrow intensifies his loathing of the elves, and yet he responds to this bitterness, with more intense loathing, with a more intense desire to correct what he sees as a world that has wronged him and those he has loved. And his efforts backfire. They backfire on him, but more importantly to him, they backfire on the people he cares about. He does not ameliorate the suffering of humanity, he only unintentionally amplifies it. This is true on a personal level as well as on a large-scale political level. When Soren is deeply sick and would have otherwise died, Viren used dark magic to revitalize him, to allow him to live again. He deeply loved his son then, and nothing was going to persuade him to just let his son die, and yet his use of dark magic seems to have frightened away his wife, Lissa. She is not a fan of necromancy, it seems, not a fan of bringing people back from the dead. And so Viren grows to resent his son, and it leads to his son, this stereotypical dumb jock in a lot of ways, who is very different from his father, becoming increasingly alienated from his father and ultimately rebelling against him. This rebellion thus intensifies the isolation and the alienation of Claudia, his only daughter, and she becomes more extreme. She becomes more enthralled by Erebos. When her father dies, she is the one who brings him back to life. She views herself as tied to her father and tied to Erebos in this war, brutal and unmediated, between those she cares about, an increasingly small number of people, and a hostile world. Viren did not want this. He did not want to further the seeds of rancor and division. He did not want to break his family apart. He wanted to keep it together, and yet he broke it apart anyway. His daughter, the person he cares most about in the world, becomes deranged and obsessive. Viren becomes increasingly aware of the futility of his efforts starting in Season 4. He understands that regardless of how passionately and how direly he pushes for ends he considers moral and just and reasonable, doing so just leads to the people he loves suffering more. And this leads to an interesting reaction from Viren. Saying he regrets everything he did would be a bit far, but his spirit has changed. His ambition, his impassioned, emphatic will to right the world has become decayed and corroded. He does not trust himself and his ambitions anymore. He views the world as needing to be accepted. There is a certain progression of things, of people, of political conflicts, of sociological tensions, that is ultimately beyond one's control, and attempting to control this world is both perverse from a philosophical standpoint and counterproductive from a practical standpoint. It only, at best, is pointless, and at worst intensifies the suffering of good and decent people. He ultimately chooses, more or less, to end his own life. All he can do is turn his back on his prior ethos, which was constant striving, and say, no, this sadly cannot work. This manifestation of what Schopenhauer calls the will, this desire for life, this desire to secure one's own ambitions and desires, this yearning to pursue certain goals and objectives, ultimately will never leave one satisfied. It will only leave one empty and divided from the world. And so that will, that constant urging, the constant yearning must be snuffed. Viren ultimately does this through his death. This is quite dark. And it's worth reflecting on what this means. I think about the philosophical ideas of the Enlightenment, someone like John Locke or Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who ultimately believed that the world was malleable, that reason, contemplating what is the right and proper order for the world, and then acting on that reason, can ultimately lead to a transformation of society for the better, extinguishing superstition and injustice and replacing it with a more rational and cohesive world. At its best, this can produce societies that are no longer tied to the past, no longer tied to the mechanical repetition of traditions and customs for their own sake, and allow the free play of the mind regarding what is genuinely best for the flourishing of humanity. At worst, which is I think what we're at with Viren, this leads to the belief that there is nothing besides reason that matters. That if you have a glimpse of an injustice in the world, that you have identified it with your mind, then pursuing attempts through thought and contemplation to ameliorate it is necessarily a good thing. The Dragon Prince is less skeptical of this. It can lead to destruction. It can lead to the loss of relationships, a unwillingness to understand that the world is more complicated than the original rational impulses of the mind can consider, that our perspectives are inevitably narrow and limited, and that our attempts to make the world better may backfire on us and those we care about. The Dragon Prince is not anti-enlightenment, but it does emphasize the need for people to work together and to try to compromise. Harrow does not have a grandiose answer to the problems of the world in the same way that Viren does, but he acknowledges that maybe there is no big answer, there is no absolute solution. There is only a lot of little actions that we take, and slowly and gradually, through interacting with other people, through developing ideas in concert with those we respect, slowly groups of people can arrive at a solution that works for the benefit of all. It is not as dramatic as Viren's ideas, and it is fundamentally less grandiose, and there is no guarantee that it will even work. Harrow died. He was assassinated. But Viren's storyline proves that this often frustrating and murky desire to interact with others, swap ideas, and communally develop a conception of what is true and what needs to be done is the best way to avoid falling into monomania. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can and you want to see more videos like this before anyone else. Keep watching The Dragon Prince. It is a brilliant and thoughtful show, and I can't wait for the last 2 seasons. Take care. Adios, comrades.